And I love that you have other ways of getting this information out. Not only are you very active with your website and with Twitter and trying to push this message forward, but you're also and at the conferences as well. But you're also doing this documentary, which we got to see. I think it was an 8-minute preview of at the conference, which was really, really good. Again, I'm really great friends with Robin and Matt. You were able to go over to their house and spend some time. I just talked to Matt about how special that was for him to be able to see you and have dinner with you and hang out and get that footage. Tell us what you can tell us about this documentary and what your hopes are for this.
Yeah, exactly what you said. A lot of this is just getting the message out. We I want to say this delicately. Let's just say this research isn't exactly being welcomed with open arms, I guess you could say, in the scientific community. And I don't want to suggest that there's a grand conspiracy so much as there's just kind of a, let's just say there's a direction the wind is blowing, and we know we're kind of working against that, right? But that said, I'm just extremely thankful to have Jen Eisenhart, who's heading up this this whole project, and we started filming, which included, as you noted, Low Carb Denver 2023. That was one of the first things, and I'm so glad we caught it on film. But it's also caught a whole bunch of story beats, including a lot that I've not been able to share. That's going to be really interesting once it can finally be seen on film. And principal photography is nearly close to being wrapped, and then it heads into the edit. The edit's a long process, but it's been pretty exciting. I will say it's that 8-minute clip you're talking about that we got to feature at COSI. You have to understand whatever you might imagine it's like to be filmed for a documentary. I can tell you it's not that. It's whatever I imagined it was going to be. There's a whole lot of filming, there's a whole lot of staging, there's a whole lot of doing stuff, and you get to the point where you're just exhausted all the time because it's always like an extra layer onto the things you're already doing, including, by the way, for the conference. For the conference, I had to, of course, keep turning over the MC role while going and doing two different interviews because that was the one time where we happened to have people there. It was the one time it worked out for the budget, right? But then finally getting to see that teaser piece was super satisfying because it's nice when you're watching something, you're like, oh, I would actually want to see that myself. Like you, it's kind of surreal because you feel kind of removed from what you're watching, even if it's you. And and again, it's hats off to Jen and her team and the editing, the uh, you know, things, just the color grading, things that I noticed from a little bit of filmmaking myself. Just a lot of great work that's been put into it already. And that's just for that little bit. So I'm excited. I can't wait until we finally have it put together.
That's awesome. Yeah, Jen's amazing. She was one of the first people we ever interviewed on this show. And I would say to the listener, if you haven't watched Fat Fiction as you're waiting for this documentary to come out, make sure you go and watch Fat Fiction. And I will make anybody the offer that I made for any of Vinny Tortorich's movies. If you have to pay to rent this movie, you send me a Venmo request and I will reimburse you for watching it. I think it's amazing. Nobody ever takes me up on it, but the offer always stands. If you have to buy Fat 2, Beyond Impossible, or Fat Fiction, I will pay you to watch it. That's it. It was really well done. I would expect nothing less from her, and her company just does such a great job. I'm sure it was very taxing, especially with everything you had going on. I did want to make this point that I thought was interesting. I've noticed in the past that if I'm traveling to one of these conferences, right off the bat, if I meet somebody and they ask me what I'm doing or where I'm going or whatever, Uber driver or Airbnb or whatever, I say, I'm going to KetoCon, nothing. And then the conversation kind of stops there. If I say I'm going to a nutrition conference, might get a question or two or whatever, and that it kind of stops. And I noticed as this one was coming up, people were asking me what I was doing, what the conference was about, and I would say it's called, the Collaborative Science Conference, and it's really about this question, primarily about this question about cholesterol. And people would start to ask me questions, and I would always use the example of Robin in particular, and I would tell people about Robin and say, look, I've got this dear friend I've met at one of these conferences. She's bipolar. She eats this certain way. She's not bipolar, like we said earlier, but her cholesterol goes up. She can reintroduce carbohydrates. Her cholesterol will go right back down to where it's supposed to, but then she's got bipolar. So she's got a very difficult day-to-day decision to make. She spent over a decade pretty much comatose, so she can be medicated again. She could commit suicide because the symptoms are so terrible, or she could go low carb and try to learn about this bet essentially that she's making with her life. And I found that people were super compelled, wanted to share their own stories about cholesterol. I told you we got delayed because of that windstorm in Vegas. I sat in a restaurant bar at Salt Lake Airport. I had an hour-long conversation with people talking about cholesterol and what this was all about. And I started eating more meat and I feel way better. Like, but my doctor wants me to take a statin. And I always want to bring this back to the Robin, the person who this really matters for. And we talk about
Right.
the science and we talk about the numbers and we talk about all of these things. But at the end of the day, it's an individual who's our friend, who we love, who this really matters for. And this is a big, scary question that people need to ask. And there's not good answers. And they need to place really good bets on what they think is going to be best. And it's not that easy. So I wanted to say that, to just say this work is so critically important for so many things. But at the end of the day, I hope all of us can remember on the individual level, this matters a ton.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. I mean, I've talked about this in interviews before, and I'll probably talk about it in the documentary, but it was kind of a fun, curious thing for me until 2017. Like I'm at the end of 2015, November 27th of 2015 is when I got the first fateful blood test. I remember it like it was yesterday. And December 9th, 2 weeks later, was when I got the second one. The second one was what kicked off the whole curiosity spin. But between I want to say December 9th up until July of 2017, it was kind of fun. It was an effort of curiosity. But in 2017, I didn't just write about lean mass hyperresponders. The last couple paragraphs of that article, I was just speculating, following the logic of the lipid energy model, that this probably applies to children too. Makes sense. They're metabolically healthy, typically, starting out that way. So, there's a decent chance if they're also kind of lean, might see that. But people hadn't been sending me a lot of labs from children until that article came out. It was like it's like a bomb dropped. It was all these different people were like, this is me. This explains me. And then I had a neurosurgeon and his wife reach out to me. And they had a daughter, very young daughter, who was epileptic. And she was thriving on keto. Her seizures were way down. Her energy levels were way up. But the pediatrician pushed back. They were like, these cholesterol levels are unsustainable. You cannot keep her going at these levels. And for me, I mean, granted, I'm not in that same position, but I know enough about seizures that they are brain damage. Like they're not, it's a question of how much, but we don't know how much. We just know that it really is a very serious condition, to the extent to where, yeah, I mean, this is literally the origin of the Charlie Foundation, right? Um, and that's the point where it got really serious for me. So when you bring up Robin, like I when I went and interviewed her for the documentary and I got to meet her family, I couldn't help it. I got a bit emotional because I've had a friend, and in my mind I thought it was like long past. It was just, it'd been a long time since what happened, but he was struggling with bipolar his whole life. And without getting into it, I'll just say it's a tragic story. But it's kind of crazy to me, from an truly from an engineering and historical standpoint, that there are a lot of things that were thought impossible before, or for that matter, that were thought detrimental. And one thing that keeps getting played out over and over again, and I'm not saying I know for sure this is the case this time, but I can say it's been the case many times over, that aspects of the human body have been thought to be either obsolete or even detrimental. And in the case of something like a rare mutation, that makes sense, sickle cell anemia or things like that. But for something that's conserved for the majority of the population, like, is it really the case that the vast majority of us have, from the starting point, too much cholesterol that's being made, too many ApoB lipoproteins that are being made, such that we need a kind of non-ancestral intervention to bring it down to like really, really low levels, and then we'll only experience benefit? Because I've already said this many times on podcasts, I do think that you will lower your incidence of cardiovascular disease if you bring your LDL levels extremely low. It's just, I don't know how much there's a relevance towards a trade-off. I don't know. These are things I'm wanting to explore and other data avenues outside of these two questions. But if I'm facing something like seizures, if I'm facing something like bipolar, if you don't know, if you don't know, you don't know. If you don't know somebody who's had to struggle with very severe bipolar, and Robin's story is just phenomenal. It's just phenomenal. You'd get why a solution would mean everything. I've talked to a lot of my colleague Siobhan. I've talked to Siobhan about how big of a deal it was for the depression component of, ultimately helping to relieve that from going on low carb, and all of the other things on the physical end that she's benefited from in going low carb. She's said plainly, I'd give up all of that over the depression. The depression, you can't know unless you know what it's like to experience that day in and day out. So yeah, yeah, this one thing, of course, we've got to get this data. We've got to find out. And if it's true, if there's folks like Nick Norwitz able to work with his ulcerative colitis and be on this diet and yet maintain LDL at these scary, crazy high levels, but not be at the increased risk, my gosh, I really want to get that data as soon as possible so that he can know, so that I can know.
Wow. Well, we've hosted Robin on the show and got her to tell her amazing story, and encourage anybody to go check that out. But recently, I was able to interview Matt and hear his story. He's a little bit more shy, doesn't do a lot of podcast appearances, but I got to ask him that question. Like, it's one thing if you live a certain lifestyle, you have your certain data on yourself. You do whatever you like. It's your life, it's your risk. But this is your person. This is the one person you love more than anybody else. And what do you think about writing this line, making this decision with her? And he said, regardless of what she chooses, I'm there. I'm ride or die. I'll be with her. It's fine. She can do whatever she wants. But I will say I would not trade one single day of what our relationship is like right now, and the joy and awesomeness and presence that I get to experience, versus what it was like before, when she was either asleep, medicated, or going to pick up the kids, and that was like all she could really manage. So again, just to bring that human element in, I think is why this is such a compelling story, and why it really truly matters as much as it does.
Yeah, it's worth repeating that cholesterol is the most famous biological molecule by far. And of course, I understand if you're already if you're already working toward research that is potentially going to be providing data that 99% of the medical professionals and researchers out there, um, if it's counter to that expectation, then of course, like I said, it's going to be facing an enormous amount of scrutiny. But I'll just fit in this last little bit because it's fun to bring this up with my engineering friends. Is I have some that have been following my journey this whole time, and so whenever somebody says something like, "Yeah, you realize you don't have any credentials for this, Dave. You're not at all qualified to be doing this." They're usually the ones who are slacking me, or they're sending something in the group chat and they're like, they really don't know engineers. Engineers, like, you to go to whatever big engineer who's working on something and be like, yeah, you're not qualified to do this thing that you're working on. Engineers, that's like a rallying call. You're basically challenging them to see if they can prove you wrong, because you feel that confident in what it is that you're saying they can't do. Um, that's the story of engineers in general. That's why they tend to be so, bullheaded about doing things their way. Um, so yeah. And now we're getting there. We're getting there to where we're actually getting this data. We're finally collecting it.
That's amazing. Wow. Okay. One last thing I just have to touch on with you. Eating a low carbohydrate diet, I feel pretty good and happy most of the time. And so every now and again, I like to, go back to the other side and get really upset and angry. And I always go to one of my least favorite podcasts ever done, ever that I've ever listened to. Features you as an appearance on the Peter Attia podcast. Nothing against Peter Attia. I love the dude. I respect the guy. You've got differences of opinion on the drive. And ironically, he also hosted my absolute favorite episode of all time that I've ever heard, which is his episode with Dr. Sarah Hallberg, which is
Yeah.
just amazing. The episode that was done with you, I thought was completely unfair, as he's again, I hate to do this, but like the condescension and the way he was talking with you, especially as that conversation was winding down, I thought was so unmerited. He kept saying, "You're hanging out with the wrong crowd. You need to hang out with the right people. You're playing, twiddly sticks on Twitter with all these guys. Like, you need to go to these right conferences." And you said something like, "Well, these conferences cost a lot of money to go to." And he interrupted you, cut you off, and said, "Well, the low carbohydrate community should fund you to go. If they cared about these answers, they should pay for your way to go to some of these conferences." And I'm very happy to say that this community has stepped up and shown with their dollars that they are very much willing to pay money to get answers to some of these things. I had to throw that in there. I'm so proud and happy of people in the community to step up and to help you and others who are genuine citizen scientists seeking truth and doing this great work out there. Makes me super proud.
Yeah, amen. I cannot express enough thank because think about it. When we were having that podcast, this was in 2018, and to go to an NLA conference, it was like $1,000. And to Peter's credit, he was all ready to make good on that promise, because at the time I didn't have a lot of. I was being very mindful of how much money I was going to spend, but on top of that, it was the ROI. Okay, if I go to this conference, what can I expect to get? Right. And I'll have you know that I did end up going to the conference that he was willing to pay for that was like coming up next, but I realized I couldn't take his money anyway. Because let's say that I had gone, and let's say that I did have an experience that swayed me a little bit more in his direction, it might look to others like that was the reason, was because he paid for it. So I didn't want to be connected to somebody's goodwill, and I credit him for that. It's interesting. I have a donor who we're kind of negotiating a little bit. He's talking very seriously. He'd like me to do a reaction, like a revisiting of that podcast. And so there's a chance I might at some point like re-listen to it, because it would be interesting to see it in the current context, because that was one of the things we were speculating on at that time. But getting back to the support component, yeah, I would rather the low carb community not pay for me going to an NLA conference in the first place. I love that we're raising money specifically to get the data itself, to literally go and get that data. You want to know, I've got one more thing to brag about with our community and with particularly our participants. They told me up front, you've got to be mindful that you're still going to have probably a 15 to 20% drop off of participants. That's just typical of all studies, right? And I remember thinking at the time, I was like, dang it, I really wanted to get to 100 though. I specifically want 100 participants. So even one participant dropping out, I should have tried to make it something more like 110 or 120. And man, am I excited to tell you, we didn't have a single participant drop out. Not one of the 100. I'm not talking one of 10. I'm talking of 100 participants. All of them got their second scans. All of them flew it the first time for their first scans. They all got their second scans. And I can never state enough. That's how serious this citizen science movement is. So yeah, I love to what degree I can help move this along, but this has many authors to it. And I can never thank enough people enough times for the money, for the sweat equity, for everything that they've done to buy in, including COSI. You know, COSI it was really cathartic for us. And again, it made me realize that it's not just about the material means that I just talked about. It's also feeling like we can help to drive each other to move this thing forward. And yeah, it's great. You hear the term grassroots all the time. It's used so like loosely. This is the real thing. This is grassroots.